Welcome to another presentation on the dictionary series from the Missing Faces in Teaching. My name is Dr. Marie Charles. Now, one of the names under investigation clearly has been given through the thumbnail clue of Davis or David, and it is now under the microscope or onomastic analysis. And Davis, as you can see from those very famous individuals, is an FB name. We have Miles Davis, the famous jazz musician. We have Sammy Davis Jr., the entertainer. We have Kevin Davy, who is a UK musician, and we're going to come back to him. We have Aussie Davis, who was an American actor, and so much more. We have Angela Davis, author, activist and professor. And we have David Oyelowo, who is a UK actor who played, among many of his roles, Dr. King. Now, you can see the many variants of David as David, Dawood, and those names, those surnames are found moving up from France in Lincolnshire, Cambridgeshire, Norfolk and Leicestershire. We also find that the name, the biblical name, is clearly an original Hebrew name, David, or Dawood, which meant beloved one or loved by God. Although some academics and scholars say that it could actually mean paternal uncle. But we find evidence of that name 1,000 years ago in the original FB populations. Now, let's just return and have a look at Kevin Davy. Davy, obviously a variant, a form of David. We find that surname Davy from Jean Davy of Burgundy. And he is a 14th century knight of the Golden Fleece. And his image and crest are on page 44 of the New Dictionary, part 3. And he's a Duke of Burgundy, located in East Central France. We get a clue to his extreme wealth from his crest. His crest is a beautiful gold and red adorned crest, but just below his neck and around the upper part of him is this beautiful gold jewellery, which signifies and signals his extreme wealth. And of course, you will see him documented in the dictionary part 3 on the onomastic coded maps, and you will see all of those surrounding areas of FBs and their wealth and their surnames, not out of place, but in its kind of topographical context. Now, we also find that as it's moving through globally, that name, David, that we find an individual called William Davidson, who is documented in issue 14, and his portrait is shown him with dreadlocks, and he was involved in the Cato Street conspiracy, which was an attempt to overthrow the UK government in 1820. And you will see his name, his famous name, and his image in that issue. But let's go back to Aussie Davis. Aussie Davis is a very interesting individual because onomastically it takes us further into the FB lineage of this name. Now, Aussie Davis, the actor, had 4 siblings, and 2 of them are here on this slide. We see William Conan Davis and his sister Essie Davis Morgan. Now, every component of their names can be traced to a black lineage. It's very, very important. But let's have a look at William. William is the French form of Guillaume, which we find as William Conqueror. But William Conan Davis was a professor of natural sciences, and some of his accomplishments are perhaps not widely known. But he was an incredible professor and innovator, and he actually discovered the biopolymer found in plants that actually create a kind of gummy, gluey consistency that we know now as mashed potato, which is incredible. He also developed, William Conan Davis, he developed the standardized tests for the detection of thyroxine in the bloodstream. And he also developed standardized blood tests for insulin and growth hormones. I mean, he was an incredible scientist and has one of the buildings named after him in Texas, William C. Davis. But isn't that interesting that his Conan, that name is actually abbreviated to just the letter C, because Conan takes us into France, because it takes us into Brittany, northwestern France, as Conan are the original, or that is the original name of the 4th century rulers in that region. Now, those rulers carrying that name Conan are going to migrate into Britain, all over Britain, and in particular we're going to find the rulers of Scotland in the form of Duke Conan IV. But our minds in the current state today, we are kind of fixed with the Hollywood interpretation of Conan as Conan the Barbarian. When in fact the definition of Conan means to be high and mighty in the sense of rulership and governance. But we find that the Duke Conan IV and his 11th century seal, which is documented in part 3, that he was the Earl, the 5th Earl of Richmond, with extensive lands in Yorkshire, as one might expect with that particular title. Now, this is the interesting part for me as a researcher and in recovering the history, is that he married Margaret, who was the sister of Malcolm IV, the King of Scotland. And so Conan married into a family where his brothers-in-law were William the Lion and Malcolm, FB Kings of Scotland. And so Conan is marrying into these foundational black kings and rulers of Scotland. And in fact, the next lineage, or the offspring, particularly of William the Lion, is going to be Alexander II, who was on the front cover of issue 12 with his beautiful black face. And so, it's a little foray into Conan, the lineage and the heritage of this royal name. Aussie Davis also had a sister called Essie Davis Morgan, and she was also a very important individual whose names take us into France, Wales, and Germany. Now, Aussie Davis Morgan, she trained as a social worker, but her work is remembered for that she became a national authority on community services and the rehabilitation of veterans with spinal cord injuries. And some of her work is featured in academic journals, and I do encourage you to go and read her statements and her work. Incredible, just incredible. And so we find that her name Morgan is part of the Welsh royal rulership through Cornida and Morgan, and they are cousins who sit on the throne and rule Wales in the 4th and 5th centuries. And interestingly, they are from the same region, or the House of Gwynedd, which I talked about in my last presentation, which was the region where John Doe finds himself. But Morgan and his cousin sit on the throne. We also find from the evidence that the French crest, the 15th century French crest of Jean-Baptiste Morgan from Picardy or Picardy in France. And if you look at the first few letters of that name, we find another connection, linguistic connection, to the Picts of Scotland. We also find Morian and Morien as variants of Morgan from Finland. And so these global FB populations are finding their form and their expression in Germany as Moringen from Morgan, in a region called Schwarzenberg. And we know that Schwarz means black and Berg is region or town or district, and that translates into the black region, the black town or the black province. And so this is where we are. Through the study and evidence of onomastic research, we can evidence very, very competently and confidently that Alfred the Great, the King of England, 848 to 899, is documented and evidenced through the same methodologies to substantiate his FB origin. And in this particular issue, in Dictionary 3, you will see through primary source documentation images never seen before of King Alfred. I mean, King Alfred is really quite an exceptional ruler of so many firsts and innovations as the ruler of Britain, that he is to be revered in all the right ways. And then in part 3 we also discover that through the surname Dallison, which is where we get Alison and Alice from, that it leads us into the research pathway of King Charles VII and his beautiful image, never seen before. And it takes us into the French court through Alençon. And we also find that his father, King Charles VI, is also documented in part 3. And he's very, very interesting as a ruler. He was called the Glass King because he thought he was made of glass. And he even had iron rods inserted into his clothes to prevent him from what he thought would break, his bones would break. But it's, it's very, very interesting evidence. And so you can see, and I also like to thank Dr. Valentine for inspiring many of us with his wonderful saying the deeper they dig, the blacker the planet becomes, because it actually is so true in terms of research endeavours, because the deeper the dictionary digs, the blacker Britain becomes, and by extension, Europe. So, it's pretty incredible that we are now in a trilogy. We now have a trilogy of dictionaries to offer, with a tremendous amount of evidence and documentation. And I hope that you have been inspired to pick up a copy. Until next time, Ku Amsha to awaken.